It was 2015, and I had taken a job as a border duty officer between Canada and the United States. The stretch of land I patrolled wasn't the typical checkpoint with lines of cars and passports being stamped. It was a remote, dense forest area in British Columbia that stretched into the mountains. The area was notorious for being a smuggler's route decades ago, but with better technology and fewer incidents, the post was more of a formality now. The cabin I used as my base was built in the 1950s and hadn't been updated much since. It was old, creaky, and isolated, but for a solitary person like me, it worked just fine. The cabin sat about 20 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by towering evergreens and rocky terrain. A gravel path, barely wide enough for my truck, snaked its way to the cabin. It was equipped with the basics: a wood stove, a cot, a desk with a CB radio, and an old generator out back that powered a single overhead light and a small fridge. There was no internet, no cell service, and no one else within miles. My job was simple: monitor the area, make sure no one was crossing illegally, and report anything suspicious. Most nights were quiet, with nothing but the wind in the trees and the occasional call from the regional office checking in. That night, the rain started around dusk. It wasn't a drizzle, but a heavy, relentless downpour. The kind that soaked you to the bone in seconds and turned the forest floor into a slippery mess. I sat inside the cabin, the wood stove crackling in the corner, sipping on a cup of instant coffee. The rain drummed against the tin roof, a steady rhythm that was oddly comforting. I had the radio tuned to a local station, its faint static occasionally interrupted by soft country music. It felt like any other night, just another shift in the middle of nowhere. Around 9 p.m., I decided to step outside for a moment. The air was cold, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I pulled my hood up and walked to the edge of the clearing, shining my flashlight into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense underbrush and the glistening bark of the trees. Everything was still, the only sound the rain hitting the leaves. Satisfied that all was quiet, I turned back toward the cabin. That's when I noticed something odd. There were tracks in the mud near the front steps. At first, I thought they were mine, but the size was wrong, too big to be my boots. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still sharp, and they led away from the cabin into the woods. My heart started to race. I hadn't seen anyone approach, and the rain would have washed away older tracks. Someone had been here recently, possibly while I was inside. I followed the tracks with my flashlight, but they disappeared into the trees after a few yards. The ground was too wet and churned up to make out anything clearly. I felt a knot form in my stomach. It wasn't unusual for hikers or hunters to pass through, but they usually stayed on the marked trails, miles from where I was stationed. Whoever this was, they were off the beaten path and on my watch. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I double-checked the windows, making sure they were secure. The radio crackled to life as the regional office did their routine check-in. I considered mentioning the tracks, but decided against it. Without more evidence, it would just sound paranoid. Instead, I told them everything was fine and settled back into my chair, trying to shake the unease creeping over me. An hour passed. The rain didn't let up, and the cabin felt smaller with every passing minute. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. Around 11 p.m., I heard it, a faint sound over the rain. It was a dull thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. I froze, straining to listen. Another thud, closer this time. My first thought was an animal, a bear maybe, but something about it felt deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and my sidearm, a standard issue 9mm, and stepped outside. The rain was colder now, biting against my face. I scanned the clearing, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. First, I saw nothing, but then, about 20 feet from the cabin, I noticed something on the ground. It was a pile of branches, hastily arranged, almost like someone had tried to cover something up. My hands trembled as I approached, the mud sucking at my boots with every step. I used the barrel of the flashlight to push the branches aside, revealing what was underneath. It was a dead deer, its body twisted unnaturally, the neck at an odd angle. The kill was fresh. The blood hadn't even clotted yet. But what caught my attention was the lack of bite marks or scratches. This wasn't the work of a predator. The deer's legs were broken, almost as if it had been thrown or dropped from a height. I backed away, my heart pounding. Something was very wrong. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me and bolting it for good measure. I radioed the regional office, reporting the dead deer and the strange tracks I had found earlier. They assured me they'd send someone out in the morning, but their tone was dismissive. Out here, strange things happened all the time, and they weren't about to send a team into the woods at night over a dead animal. I was on my own. The hours dragged on. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept the lights off, not wanting to draw attention, and sat in the dark with my sidearm on the desk. Around 3 a.m., the power went out. The overhead light flickered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. The rain had likely knocked out the generator, but I wasn't about to go outside to check. I lit a kerosene lamp, its dim glow casting long shadows across the room. That's when I heard it again, the thud. This time it was right outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I gripped the sidearm tightly. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping noise. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the generator. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the back window and peering out. The rain made it hard to see, but in the faint light of the lamp, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something or someone was crouched near the generator. I debated my options. I could stay inside and hope they went away, or I could confront them. Neither choice felt particularly safe. Before I could decide, there was a loud bang against the back door. I jumped, my heart racing as the sound echoed through the cabin. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. I shouted a warning, my voice cracking with fear. The banging stopped, replaced by silence. I waited, the sidearm trembling in my hands, but nothing happened. Slowly, I approached the door, pressing my ear against the wood. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy breathing on the other side. And then, without warning, the door gave way, the old wood splintering as it was forced open. I stumbled back, firing blindly into the darkness. The noise was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the room. When I stopped, my ears ringing, the doorway was empty. Whoever or whatever had been there was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I barricaded myself in the corner, the sidearm clutched tightly in my hands, and waited for dawn. When the first light of day broke through the trees, I ventured outside. The rain had stopped, and the forest was eerily quiet. The tracks were gone, washed away by the storm, and the dead deer had vanished. The only evidence of the night's events was the shattered door and the spent shell casings on the floor. The regional office arrived later that morning, but their search turned up nothing. They chalked it up to a bear or a prankster, but I knew better. Whatever was out there that night wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a joke. I quit the job a week later, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched every time I stepped outside. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure: I'll never set foot in those woods again. I never really liked going up to the woods. Sure, I enjoyed the outdoors to an extent, an occasional hike or a weekend fishing trip, but something about remote cabins always put me on edge. Still, when my dad's old friend and business partner, Tom, invited me up to his cabin for a few days to help him out with a project. I couldn't really say no. My dad trusted him, and I didn't want to let him down. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 26. I had a steady job in the city, but I didn't mind taking a few days off. Tom's cabin was located deep in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. He described it as rustic, which I figured meant no Wi-Fi, minimal cell service, and probably a lot of mosquitoes. Still, it seemed harmless enough, and Tom had been nothing but friendly to me growing up. The drive up was long, almost 6 hours of winding mountain roads that seemed to get narrower and more desolate the further I went. By the time I reached the gravel road leading to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The dense forest pressed in on either side, the tall trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. When I finally pulled up, the cabin was exactly what I expected. A small, weathered structure with a steep roof and a porch that looked like it had seen better days. Tom was waiting outside, leaning against a beat-up old truck. He waved as I parked, his face splitting into a wide grin. Tom was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a rugged demeanor that matched the surroundings. He looked like he belonged in a place like this. After unloading my bags, he showed me around the cabin. It was simple but functional: a small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and 2 bedrooms. The project he wanted help with was vague. He said something about clearing out some old junk and maybe repairing a section of the roof. I didn't press him for details. I figured I'd see what he meant the next day. That night, we had a quiet dinner of canned chili and beer. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up outside, but Tom didn't seem to notice. The next morning, Tom woke me up early. He handed me a cup of coffee and told me we'd start by clearing out the shed behind the cabin. The shed was an old, rickety structure, barely standing, and packed to the brim with boxes, tools, and random junk. Most of it seemed useless: rusted saws, broken lanterns, and piles of newspapers dating back to the 90s. By midday, I was drenched in sweat and covered in dirt. Tom barely said a word as we worked, which was fine by me. I wasn't much for small talk, especially when the task at hand was so monotonous. As we dug deeper into the shed, I started to notice something odd. A lot of the stuff we were pulling out didn't look like it belonged to Tom. There were kids' toys, old clothes, even a few pieces of furniture. When I asked about it, Tom just shrugged and said the shed had been there long before he bought the property. That afternoon, he suggested we take a break and hike to a nearby stream. The trail was overgrown and barely visible in some places, but Tom seemed to know it well. The stream was beautiful, its clear water glinting in the sunlight, but the isolation of the place was starting to get to me. Something about the forest felt off. It wasn't just the silence, though that was unnerving enough. It was the way the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting into shapes that looked almost unnatural. I chalked it up to my imagination and followed Tom back to the cabin. That evening, as we sat on the porch, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey. The sun had just set, and the forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. We sat in silence for a while, the alcohol warming my chest and dulling my unease. It wasn't until I went to bed that the real trouble began. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside my window, a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a raccoon, but the longer I listened, the more deliberate the movements seemed. I got up and peered out the window, but I couldn't see much beyond the porch light's dim glow. The forest beyond was pitch black. I stood there for a few minutes, my heart pounding, but eventually convinced myself it was nothing. The next morning, I mentioned it to Tom. He just laughed and said the woods were full of critters, though his reaction felt a little too casual. Over the next couple of days, the unease only grew. I started noticing strange things: scratches on the shed door that hadn't been there before, footprints in the dirt that didn't match mine or Tom's boots. At night, the rustling outside my window continued, and once, I thought I heard a low, guttural sound, like an animal growling. Tom didn't seem bothered by any of it. If anything, he seemed more focused, almost obsessive, about clearing out the shed. By the third day, we had emptied most of it, and that's when we found it. In the far corner of the shed, hidden beneath a pile of tarps and old blankets, was a wooden box. It was about the size of a large trunk, with heavy metal clasps and a padlock. The wood was weathered and stained, and it smelled faintly of mildew. Tom's demeanor changed the moment we uncovered it. He became tense, almost nervous, and insisted we drag it into the cabin. Inside, he pried it open with a crowbar. The lock was old and rusted, and it didn't take much effort to break it. Inside the box was a collection of old photographs, documents, and what looked like personal belongings. A locket, a pair of glasses, even a few yellowed letters. The photos were the most disturbing. They showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 young children, posing in front of what looked like the very same cabin. In some of the photos, the man was holding a rifle, and the woman had a strained smile, like she didn't want to be there. Tom didn't say much as he went through the box, but his hands trembled slightly. He seemed particularly interested in the letters, which he read in silence before stuffing them into his pocket. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rustling outside my window was louder than ever, and this time, it was accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps on the porch. I stayed in bed, frozen, clutching the pocket knife I always carried. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. I bolted upright, my heart racing, but by the time I got to the living room, the door was closed and Tom was gone. I found him outside, standing near the edge of the woods with a flashlight in one hand and a rifle in the other. When I called out to him, he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring into the darkness. The next morning, Tom seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn. He barely spoke as we finished clearing out the shed, and by the time evening rolled around, I was ready to leave. That night, as I packed my things, I found one of the photographs from the box tucked into my bag. It was a picture of the cabin, taken from the same angle as the one I had first seen. But this time, there was someone standing in the window, a man with a dark, unrecognizable face. I left the next morning without saying goodbye. As I drove down the gravel road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. Tom was standing on the porch, watching me leave. I never went back, and I never told my dad about what happened. A few weeks later, I tried calling Tom, but his number was disconnected. When I asked my dad about him, he just shrugged and said they hadn't spoken in months. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something terrible happened in that cabin. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if Tom ever really left. It was supposed to be a quick getaway. I wanted some time away from the noise of my life, so I rented a small cabin far off the main roads. I didn't want anything fancy, just a roof over my head, a place to sleep, and some quiet. The ad online said it was a rustic cabin deep in the wilderness of Montana. Perfect, I thought. Exactly what I needed. I left my apartment early that morning in my old truck, packed with enough food and supplies for a few days. The drive was peaceful at first. The highway stretched endlessly before me, with snow-capped mountains in the distance. The farther I drove, the less traffic I saw. Towns grew smaller, gas stations more spread out, and cell service started to flicker in and out. By mid-afternoon, I turned off the main road onto a gravel path that twisted through dense forest. The map I'd printed said the cabin was another 15 miles from there, though it felt much farther. The trees on either side of the road were tall and thick, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The forest seemed alive with noises, birds chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant sound of running water. I passed a couple of signs warning about wildlife: bears, mountain lions, and even wolves. I kept driving, feeling the unease creep in. This far out, if something went wrong, there'd be no one to help me. But I shook off the thought. I was here to relax, not scare myself. After what felt like forever, I reached the cabin. It was small, with weathered wooden walls and a slanted tin roof. A stone chimney poked out from one side, and a stack of firewood was neatly piled next to the porch. There was no one around for miles, as far as I could tell. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No cars, no voices, just the occasional sound of the wind moving through the trees. I unloaded my truck and brought my things inside. The cabin was just as simple as the ad had promised. One room with a bed, a small table, a wood-burning stove, and a couple of chairs. The bathroom was a tiny outhouse about 50 feet from the cabin. After unpacking, I decided to explore the area a bit. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I stayed close to the cabin, not wanting to get lost. I followed a narrow trail that led to a small stream a few hundred yards away. The water was crystal clear, and the sound of it bubbling over rocks was oddly soothing. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the woods were bathed in a deep, dark blue. I started a fire in the stove and made myself a simple dinner. The warmth of the fire and the crackling sound of the wood burning were comforting. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. That peace didn't last long. Later that night, I was sitting by the fire, reading a book I'd brought, when I heard it, a faint sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it didn't quite sound like that. It was more deliberate, like footsteps crunching on gravel. I froze, listening intently, but the noise stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got up and peeked out the window, but it was pitch black outside. The forest seemed to swallow the light from the cabin. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and went back to my book, trying to ignore the creeping unease. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart was pounding now. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it out the window, but I couldn't see anything, just trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence was deafening. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to doze off, I'd jolt awake, convinced I'd heard something outside. By morning, I was exhausted, but nothing had happened. I spent the day trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I went for another walk, chopped some wood, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But as the sun started to set again, the dread returned. That night, the noises started earlier. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was outside. I heard twigs snapping and leaves rustling, followed by that same deliberate crunch of footsteps. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it out the window again, scanning the forest. And then I saw it. Just for a second, the beam of light caught someone, standing among the trees. A man, wearing dark clothes, his face obscured by a hood or a hat. He was watching the cabin, standing perfectly still. I froze, my heart racing. When I moved the flashlight back to where he'd been, he was gone. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting by the fire with the flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other. The footsteps came and went, sometimes circling the cabin, sometimes fading into the woods. I never saw him again that night, but I knew he was out there. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed my things as quickly as I could and threw them in the truck. I didn't care how much of the rental I'd paid for. I just wanted to leave. As I started the engine and pulled onto the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the trees behind the cabin, a figure disappearing into the shadows. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the highway, miles away from the forest. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know I'll never go back to that cabin. The quiet and solitude I'd been looking for had turned into something else entirely, something I'll never forget. It was the summer of 2015 when I decided to spend a week at my late wife's family cabin. It had been 6 months since her death, and I thought revisiting the place where we'd shared some of our happiest memories might help me process my grief. The cabin belonged to her family, a modest, secluded retreat tucked deep in the forests of northern Michigan. I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea, but her sister, Claire, and her mother, Diane, insisted I join them. They wanted to remember her together, and I felt I owed them that much. The 4-hour drive from Chicago was uneventful. The roads thinned out as I got closer to the cabin, and soon, all I could see were tall pines and winding gravel paths. The air felt cooler here, cleaner. By the time I arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the driveway. The cabin stood as I remembered it, small but sturdy, with a wraparound porch and a view of the lake out back. Claire greeted me at the door. She was always the warm, bubbly one, the kind of person who could light up a room. Diane was quieter, more reserved, but she managed a small smile as she hugged me. Claire's husband, Eric, wasn't coming. He had work commitments that left just the three of us. The first couple of days passed without incident. We cooked meals together, hiked the nearby trails, and spent evenings by the fire, sharing stories about my wife. It was bittersweet, comforting, but also painful. I kept catching glimpses of her in the little things. The way Diane tilted her head when she laughed, the way Claire hummed to herself while cooking. On the third day, I decided to take a walk alone. I needed some time to clear my head. There was a trail that led from the cabin to a small clearing about a mile away, and I thought it might be a good spot to sit and think. I told Claire and Diane where I was going, grabbed a bottle of water, and set off. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around me the further I went. The air was damp and heavy, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. When I reached the clearing, I found a fallen log to sit on and took a long drink of water. The space was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The trees formed a tight circle around the clearing, their branches interlocking above me like a cathedral ceiling. I sat there for a while, lost in thought, until a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling leaves. But as I listened, it grew louder, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on gravel. I turned my head, scanning the edge of the clearing, but I couldn't see anyone. Probably just an animal, I thought to myself. But the sound didn't stop. It moved, circling the clearing, always just out of sight. My heart began to race. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded thin and small in the vastness of the forest. The footsteps stopped. I stood up, gripping the water bottle tightly in my hand. The forest was silent again, but the silence felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I took a step toward the trail, ready to head back to the cabin, when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the growl of a dog or a bear. It was deeper, more primal. I turned and ran. The trail seemed longer on the way back, the trees closer together. I stumbled more than once, scraping my hands and knees on the rough ground. I could still hear the growling behind me, along with the sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching. Whatever it was following me. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the clearing around the cabin, I was gasping for breath. Claire and Diane were on the porch, their faces pale with concern. "What happened?" Claire asked, but I couldn't answer. I just pointed toward the woods, shaking my head. We locked the doors and windows that night, though none of us really believed it would do much good. I tried to explain what had happened, but it sounded ridiculous, even to me. A growling noise? Footsteps? Could have been anything. Still, none of us slept well. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside, set me on edge. Around midnight, I thought I heard something. Soft, almost imperceptible, like someone trying to open the back door. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. The next morning, Claire suggested we leave a day early. Diane agreed without hesitation. I didn't argue. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods around the cabin seemed darker than they had the day before, the trees more sinister. When I carried the last bag out to the car, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, large and heavy, leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin and then back again. I didn't say anything. I just got in the car and started the engine. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Claire and Diane seemed relieved to be leaving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Even as we sped down the highway, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. When I finally got home, I locked the doors and windows, something I'd never done before. I told myself it was just a precaution, that I was being paranoid. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, that low, guttural growl. This time, it was right outside my window. It was 2019 when my boss told me I'd need to head down to South America for a high-stakes meeting. I was a mid-level executive in a logistics company, the kind of person who made decisions no one noticed unless they went wrong. The meeting was in a remote part of Brazil, near the edges of the Amazon rainforest. The company I was visiting operated out of a small cabin-like office that blended into the jungle surroundings. They were a potential partner for an expansion project we'd been planning for months. I wasn't thrilled about the trip. I'm not the outdoorsy type, and the idea of being so far from civilization made me uneasy. But this was an important deal, and I wanted to make a good impression. The client insisted on hosting us at their location to showcase their operations and prove they were up to the task. The journey there was exhausting. I flew into Manaus, then took a smaller charter flight to a town whose name I can't even remember. From there, it was a grueling 4-hour drive in a rusty Jeep over unpaved roads. The driver didn't speak English, and my Portuguese was limited to a handful of words. The landscape became increasingly wild as we went deeper into the jungle. Trees towering overhead, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with humidity, and every few minutes, I'd hear the distant call of some unseen animal. When we finally arrived, I was struck by how small and isolated the place was. The office was a wooden cabin raised slightly on stilts, with a tin roof that looked like it had been patched up several times. There were a few other structures nearby, including a storage shed and what looked like living quarters for some of the staff. Beyond that, it was nothing but jungle. The man who greeted me, Paulo, was friendly enough but had a hard edge to him. He looked like someone who'd spent his whole life working in harsh conditions. He showed me around briefly, explaining how they managed their operations in such a remote location. Everything seemed to be running smoothly, but something about the place felt off. Maybe it was the way the workers avoided making eye contact with me, or the fact that there were no security cameras despite the valuable equipment lying around. The meeting itself was scheduled for the next day, so Paulo showed me to the cabin where I'd be staying overnight. It was small but comfortable enough. One room with a bed, a table, and a chair. There was no air conditioning, just a ceiling fan that barely stirred the heavy air. Outside, the jungle seemed alive with noise, chirping insects, distant howls, and the occasional rustle of leaves. I locked the door, lay down on the bed, and tried to sleep, but my nerves wouldn't let me. Around midnight, I heard something strange. At first, it was just a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking lightly on wood. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but the sound grew louder and more deliberate. It was coming from the back of the cabin, where there were no windows. My heart started to race. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just jumpy because I wasn't used to being in the jungle. But then the tapping turned into a scraping sound, like something sharp being dragged across the wall. I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I heard footsteps, not heavy, but deliberate, moving around to the front of the cabin. I grabbed my phone, thinking I'd call Paolo, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. I cursed under my breath and listened as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. Whoever it was didn't knock. They just stood there. I could hear their breathing, slow and steady, almost as if they were trying to stay quiet but couldn't help themselves. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, and the jungle noises resumed as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told Paolo what had happened. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably just one of the workers checking on me. But his tone was dismissive, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The meeting went as planned, and I was relieved when it was time to leave. But just as I was packing my things, Paolo came to see me. He said the roads were washed out from a storm during the night and that I'd have to wait another day to leave. He offered to let me stay in the main cabin with the rest of the staff, but I declined. I wanted to be alone. That night, the noises started again. This time, it was worse. I heard whispering, low and guttural, in a language I didn't understand. The footsteps were back, circling the cabin. Then there was a loud thud, as if someone had thrown something heavy against the wall. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and quietly unlocked the door, hoping to make a run for it. The jungle was pitch black, but I had a flashlight. As soon as I stepped outside, I saw them. 2 men standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the light. They were holding machetes and watching me. I froze, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't outrun them. Not in the dark, not in the jungle. One of them took a step forward, and that's when I heard the growl. It was low and deep, coming from the shadows to my right. The men stopped and looked in that direction. Out of the darkness came a massive jaguar, its eyes glowing in the light of my flashlight. It didn't attack me, it went straight for the men. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from that place. I don't know how long I ran before I collapsed from exhaustion. By some miracle, a search party found me the next day. They said I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. I couldn't shake the feeling that the men had been waiting for me, that they'd been planning something. And as I boarded the plane back home, I realized I'd probably never know the truth. But I still hear the whispers sometimes, in my dreams. And I always wake up sweating, wondering if they'll ever come looking for me. I went up to the cabin alone, something I hadn't done in years. It wasn't the first time I'd been there, but it was the first time I'd gone without my family. Usually, we'd all pack into the SUV, dragging coolers of food, board games, and enough firewood to last a week. But this time, I wanted the quiet. I needed it. Work had been stressful, and I thought a long weekend in the mountains would help me reset. The cabin was about 3 hours from the city, tucked deep into the woods of northern Maine. It wasn't anything fancy. 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. My dad had built it when I was a kid, and it still smelled faintly of pine and smoke. The drive there was uneventful. The paved roads gave way to gravel and then to dirt. Snow still lingered in patches on the side of the road, though most of it had melted. When I reached the cabin, the air was cold, the sky a dull gray. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the floor creaking under my boots. It was exactly as I remembered. A little dusty, maybe, but the same old furniture, the same faded rug in front of the fireplace, the same wood-paneled walls. I set my bag down in the smaller bedroom and started a fire to warm the place up. I had brought enough food for the weekend, mostly simple stuff: cans of soup, crackers, coffee. After unpacking, I walked out to the edge of the property to check the small generator. It still worked, though it sputtered a bit when I turned it on. The cabin wasn't hooked up to any main power lines. It relied on the generator for electricity and a large propane tank for heat and cooking. As the sun dipped lower, I decided to go for a short walk. The woods around the cabin were dense, the trees bare except for the occasional pine. The ground was muddy, the snow melting into slush. I followed a narrow trail that looped around the property, my boots sinking into the soft earth. I didn't see another soul. That was one of the reasons I liked this place. It felt truly isolated. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was just the quiet. I wasn't used to it after months of city noise. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. When I got back to the cabin, the fire had burned low. I added more wood, then heated up a can of soup on the propane stove. I ate in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The first night passed without incident. I slept well, the cold air making the heavy quilt feel like a cocoon. In the morning, I made coffee and sat on the small porch, staring out at the woods. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled damp. I spent most of the day chopping wood and cleaning up around the cabin. By afternoon, I decided to hike further than I had the day before. There was an old logging road about half a mile away that I wanted to check out. The road was overgrown, the ruts filled with muddy water. I followed it for about an hour, the trees pressing in on either side. It felt eerily still, as though the woods were holding their breath. Then I noticed something strange, a footprint in the mud. It wasn't mine. It was larger, wider, and the tread didn't match my boots. I crouched down to look at it more closely. It was fresh, probably made that morning. My first thought was that it belonged to a hunter, though it wasn't hunting season. Still, it wasn't entirely unusual for people to wander out here. I continued on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I thought I heard movement in the woods, a branch snapping, leaves rustling. I stopped and looked around, but I never saw anything. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting. I locked the door behind me, something I didn't normally do out here. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the footprint didn't mean anything. But I couldn't relax. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and rattling the windows. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, a faint, scraping sound. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but it didn't happen again. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Just outside the cabin, near the back door, were more footprints. They were the same size as the one I'd seen on the logging road, and they led around the side of the cabin, stopping near the window of the bedroom where I'd slept. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking the windows and locking the doors. I even considered leaving early, but I didn't want to let my paranoia ruin the trip. Instead, I stayed close to the cabin, keeping the fire going and a heavy flashlight within arm's reach. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard it again, the scraping sound. It was faint, almost like metal on wood. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. I shone the beam outside, but I didn't see anything. The sound stopped, and the rest of the night was quiet. In the morning, I found fresh footprints again, this time leading from the tree line to the porch. That was it. I decided to leave. I packed my bag quickly, not even bothering to eat breakfast. As I loaded up the car, I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting someone to step out from behind the trees. The drive back to the city felt agonizingly slow. I kept checking the rearview mirror, my mind racing. I didn't know who had been out there or why they were watching me. Weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told myself it was probably nothing. A hunter, a hiker, someone who didn't mean any harm. But late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd remember the footprints by the bedroom window, and I'd wonder if they were still out there watching someone else. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to rent a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. I was 27 back then, burned out from my job in the city and desperately needing some time away. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I'd be off the grid for a couple of weeks. It felt freeing to disappear, even if only for a little while. The cabin I found was perfect, or so I thought at the time. It was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, and surrounded by dense trees. It was small but had everything I needed: a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a fireplace. The landlord didn't seem too concerned about paperwork, which suited me just fine. He handed me the key, gave me vague directions, and told me to leave it under the mat when I was done. When I arrived, the cabin looked even more isolated than I had imagined. The dirt road leading to it was overgrown with weeds, and the trees seemed to press in from all sides. There was no cell service, no internet, and no noise other than the wind rustling through the leaves. It felt like stepping into another world. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, hiking, and sitting on the porch, enjoying the silence. At night, the only light came from the stars and my flashlight. The darkness was so complete that it felt like the trees had swallowed the cabin whole. It was unsettling at first, but I told myself that this was exactly what I needed: peace and quiet. On the fourth night, I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound outside. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I stayed still, listening, but the sound stopped after a few seconds. I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were faint but definitely human. My stomach sank. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I told myself it was probably just the landlord checking on the property, even though the prints didn't match the boots he'd been wearing when I met him. I spent the rest of the day feeling on edge. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods. But the forest was empty, and the only sounds were the birds and the wind. By the time night fell, I had convinced myself that I was overreacting. That night, the rustling sound came back. It was louder this time, and it seemed to be coming from just outside the cabin. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window. I shone the light outside, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The forest was still, and the porch was empty. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the cabin to see if I could find anything. The footprints were back, and this time they were closer to the cabin. It looked like someone had been walking in circles around the building. I followed the tracks for a while, but they disappeared into the woods. I felt a creeping sense of dread. It wasn't just the footprints, it was the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see someone standing behind me. But the woods were empty as always. By the time I got back to the cabin, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed up my things and started the car, but it wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died no matter how many times I turned the key. I checked under the hood, but everything looked fine. I was no mechanic, but the car had been running perfectly the day before. It didn't make sense. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix the car, but nothing worked. I thought about walking back to town, but it was at least 15 miles away, and I didn't want to leave the cabin unattended. I told myself I'd try again in the morning. That night, the rustling sound came back, and this time, it was accompanied by a faint tapping on the windows. I froze, clutching the flashlight, and stared at the window closest to me. The tapping stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I found scratches on the windowsill. They looked like they had been made with a knife or some kind of sharp tool. I felt sick. Whoever was out there wasn't just wandering through the woods. They were targeting me. I decided to start walking to town, even if it meant leaving the cabin behind. I packed a bag with water, snacks, and my flashlight, and I set off down the dirt road. The forest was eerily quiet, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. After a few miles, I came to a clearing with an old, rusted truck sitting in the middle of it. The truck looked like it hadn't been used in years, but the driver's side door was open. I didn't want to get too close, but something inside the truck caught my eye. It was a photograph pinned to the dashboard with a knife. My stomach turned when I saw what it was. A picture of me, sitting on the porch of the cabin. I didn't even remember anyone taking it. I ran the rest of the way back to the cabin, my mind racing. Whoever was out there knew where I was. They had been watching me, following me. I felt trapped like a mouse in a cage. The cabin no longer felt like a safe place, it felt like a target. I spent the rest of the day barricading the doors and windows with whatever I could find. I didn't know what else to do. The car still wouldn't start, and the nearest town was too far to reach on foot before nightfall. All I could do was wait and hope that whoever was out there would leave me alone. As night fell, I sat in the corner of the cabin with a knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The rustling sound started again, louder than ever. This time, it didn't stop. It moved around the cabin, circling it like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there. And then the tapping started. It was slow and deliberate, moving from one window to the next. I felt like I was going to lose my mind. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, frozen, as the tapping got louder and louder. Eventually, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, I heard the doorknob rattling. My heart stopped. Whoever it was, they were trying to get in. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The cabin was empty, and the door was still locked. But when I stepped outside, I found something on the porch. A knife, stuck into the wood, with another photograph pinned underneath it. This one was of me, sleeping in the corner of the cabin. I didn't pack. I didn't think. I just ran. I don't know how far I got before I collapsed, but eventually, a farmer found me on the side of the road. He drove me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They checked the cabin, but whoever had been there was long gone. The only thing they found was the knife and the photographs. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who was out there. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear the sound of tapping on my windows.